Hello, everyone. Welcome to our special event today on race and anti-racism, organized by Archer, American Romanian Coalition for Human and Equal Rights. I'm Mihaela Campion, one of the founders of this incredible group of dedicated human rights activists, and I have the pleasure and honor today to introduce our special guests. Professor Marius Turda, Romanian historian and academic, one of the world's leading experts in racism, eugenism, and medical history, and Cristina Bejan, Romanian-American historian, theater artist, poet, and passionate activist for human rights and anti-racism. Welcome, and thank you so much for accepting our invitation to be here today and talk to us about race and anti-racism in a time that is more needed than ever, I would say. So I would like you to say a few words about yourself, and hopefully, those who are listening to us now will get to know you better and familiarize themselves with your work, and also ask questions and have a dialogue with us today. Professor Turda. Cristina.
I was saying after Marius because he's the VIP guest.
Hey.
Oh, that's
your turn.
That is very kind of you. Thank you. I too appreciate the invitation, and it is, I suppose, a momentous occasion as well, as I was reading about your organization and the critical work it does, not only to raise awareness about rights and equality and inclusivity and diversity, but also at this particular moment, Archer is fighting and tackling racism at its roots. There's many other organizations across the USA and, of course, across Europe and Britain. So it is, in a way, very important that we all contribute to this ongoing discussion. And this is the key word Cristina and I will emphasize here. It is a conversation about race. It is a discussion about racism and anti-racism. And it is important to come to the table with your own arguments, with your own points of view, and to be open and willing to be criticized, willing to change your opinion and listen at the same time to what others have to say. So thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I do appreciate that. The first thing I should like to say is that we come into this conversation, and I particularly come into this conversation as someone who doesn't pretend to speak on behalf of a person of color or on behalf of a Black person. So I do genuinely believe that I work towards and I teach towards certain goals and principles which are anti-racist, because I believe racism is an evil modern phenomenon that actually seeping at our collective being, it's seeping at our lives, is destroying life, is making victims all over the world. So I believe in this moral fight that we can all partake. So that's the first thing I should like to say. I don't do this as an act of, yet another white scholar, as an act of charity towards a person of color, that I pretend I'm fighting his or her own fight. I fight my own fight with race and racism. Secondly, I should like to say that we need to fully acknowledge the global significance of the death of George Floyd in America. Now, of course, when it happened, we weren't quite taken, particularly in Britain and Europe. We were quite, we didn't quite realize how profoundly systemic the change is going to be and how widespread the protest is going to be. So for us who worked in the field of race and racism, it was extremely important because it immediately became such a movement. And of course, we knew about Black Lives Matter movement that started much earlier. And of course, we had similar movements across the world and in Britain. So we need to see that particular event, as an epochal moment in many ways. I mean, we see it in accordance with this unsettling reconfiguration of race within current political discourse and social practices, not only in the US, but also in Europe and in Australia, we see that, and in South America. Now, racial injustice abounds across the world. Racism is systemic rather than just the actions of individuals. We hear a lot about certain individuals doing this and that. Now we can finally visualize it as it actually works in its tentacular character. It really works, and it morphs and it changes. And in countries such as US or Britain or France, countries with a long history of racism and colonialism, we need to understand these historical traditions of race and racism, because this is not something that happened overnight. In America, as much as people like to concentrate on what is now, there is such a long history of race and anti-racism and racism. And there are many generations of people who fought. Some of them won, some of them lost. This ongoing battle with the evil of racism. So there is a long tradition of that. It's the same, of course, in countries such as Britain, and to some extent in countries such as France and Germany and so on. So across the world. So you need to recognize that historical framework. So maybe we'll say a few words about that. But of course, and I will finish my short introduction with that, there are very different ways in which the minority looks at the issue and in which majority looks at the issue. And that's something important, I suppose, we'll address as the white speakers, because we do belong to the majority white people. And of course, there's a very big distinction between how we perceive the notion of race and racism, how we perceive the notion of racism when it happens to us, if you are in a condition that actually you are identified as inferior or different or, a second class. And we know the stories about the Romanians traveling the world, particularly in Europe. And then, of course, we know the entire intra-racism that happens in countries in Europe, particularly towards the Roma. So that's something you need to see. But of course, if you are Black, if you are a person of color, if you are a Roma yourself, it is extremely different the way you perceive the whole discussion about race and racism. We white people look at individuals, people of color or Black people, they look at them as groups. So, you see, in Romania, we always see the Roma. We don't see a particular female or a particular man. We see the Roma. When I see the Romanian, I see the individual, not the collective. You see the very important distinction. So they basically non-existent in the master narratives about the past, but they become immediately visible as collective when their criminality is discussed, or their inferior nature is discussed, or their potential for trouble is discussed. So that's absolutely fundamentally important to understand that if you're a minority, you think of it as a group. If you're a majority, you think of us as individuals. And that's very, very important when we talk about race and racism, because it's how you feel it. So what I suggest we do, if we have time, and hopefully the guests would participate in, we need to accept that any form of racism conforms itself within a set of boundaries it recognizes as its own. In other words, to simplify this statement, is to say that obviously we're not going to equate or say that American racism and Romanian racism are the same. So you have internal dynamics, you have historical tradition, which is particular, you have groups which are specific, and so on and so forth. So you need to recognize the boundaries within which racism circulates, how it percolates to various themes. Some things are more important in relation to race, class, or gender, or social status in some countries, like Britain or America. In other countries, other issues are more important, maybe the issue of culture, or maybe the issue of religion. So racism, attaches itself to all these categories that it can attach to in order to survive. So we need to recognize, but at the same time, people who want to have a conversation about, we need to cross over those geographical and cultural and political boundaries. We need to overcome personal differences. And we shouldn't have an ideological debate. This is not a debate between left and right. This is a discussion between humans. This is a discussion between people. We want to do better things in order to reveal sort of how race and racism are ultimately, whether we like it or not, they are embedded in European and American culture and politics. And regrettably, as we could see these days, the impact of racism continues to be far-reaching. And so our work continues. Okay, I will stop here for now. Cristina, over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Marius. For the viewers who did not read our Facebook post build up to this moment, Marius is my mentor, and so it is an honor to share the stage with him, for me this afternoon, for him this evening. I wanted to just follow up on a few things that Marius mentioned and then speak a bit more about what I can contribute to this discussion. I am not a world expert in eugenics or the history of racism as Marius is. I am an artist and an educator, and I will talk about what we could try to think about in terms of pragmatics, how we attack this problem in a second. Marius talked about overlapping identity factors, how maybe in one culture race is more important than another, or you have some, if you're a woman, for example, that of course being very important to your identity. And the term that we're increasingly using now in education is intersectionality. So if you've heard that term, that's exactly what Marius just described in terms of these overlapping identities. Marius also mentioned the very clear truth that the three speakers are white. We are not of minority groups. We do share one national group, and that is Romania. This is important for more than one reason. This is the identity that Archer brings to the table, the American Romanian Coalition for Human and Equal Rights. This is a diaspora group that Mihaela and her team founded to attack the issue of human rights in this country in the wake of George Floyd's brutal murder. So this is the Romanian diaspora's answer at the moment. And when I found out about it, my reaction was, Mihaela, finally, you know, we've needed this for so long. Thank you, God, for creating Archer. So thank you. It is so needed. And I know that you're already doing important work because you've gotten the conversation going, but I look forward to what's to come. So yes, we are white. Yes, we all have Romanian origins, but this is the different perspective that I bring to the table. I am only half Romanian. The other half of me is incredibly American, meaning every possible group you can think of, including Danish, Irish, German, Dutch, everything. And I grew up in North Carolina. So I am very much an American voice in this conversation. I grew up in a historically Black city, Durham, North Carolina, in the American South. And I know we are all familiar with the tragic legacy of slavery in the American South and segregation that followed thereafter. So I'm saying that because this is my point of view. I currently live in Colorado, which looks like a different universe than North Carolina. Colorado is, I think, 97% white. It is a different world than the East Coast, but I am certainly learning a lot from being here. And so I mentioned arts. This is one way that we can fight for diversity, equality, and inclusion in terms of, for me, I'm a theater artist, so I put on plays. So writing plays with different characters, including artists, casting actors, employing directors who are from different backgrounds, collaborating with different points of view. And I've been able to do that with the platform Bucharest Inside the Beltway, which was founded in Washington, DC in 2013. We're gonna have our Denver launch next month, which will actually feature a very diverse and exciting program. So the arts. The other side is education. And this is something that many of you, I'm sure, maybe starting to hear a little about, decolonization in education. So I'm a history teacher. I've been teaching history at 5 universities. I'm currently teaching at Metro State here in Denver. And that is shifting the focus of the storyteller, which historically has been the white European man, right? And putting the story and the speaker in the voice of the historically oppressed, ethnic minorities, racial minorities, women. And so that is the process of decolonizing education. We are making a lot of progress. Even the fact that it's acceptable to say that Christopher Columbus was not 100% great is progress. That's okay now. When I was growing up, Christopher Columbus was 100% the best. Not so much anymore, and that's okay. And the final piece in terms of this pragmatic approach that I'm putting on the table is activism. So taking to the streets. We've had, overwhelming protests here in the United States, for the month of June, of course, protests globally. This is not the first time that this has happened. Of course, there have been protests throughout American history, but when we talk about Black Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter was actually born the same year that Bucharest Inside the Beltway was. I just realized that. And so I was living in Washington, D.C. at the time, and the BLM protest started in 2014, and that's when we really started marching. So the movement has come and gone depending on events and the discourse and the climate of conversation. So those are 3 things I put on the table. We got the arts, education, and activism in terms of the pragmatic approach, and I will stop there for now.
Well, and I come from a completely different field. I'm a psychotherapist, so, but before that, I sometimes I have an uneasiness about labeling. I am, or I do, or I am, because I think we wear so many hats. And the one that I embrace the most is the one of humanity. I want to be as human and as understanding of others as I can possibly be. Now, my work is offering that platform a lot. And I had the privilege to have intimate conversations in therapeutic sessions with people of any possible diverse background. And that to me enhanced my life and my understanding of human experience. And before becoming a psychotherapist in the United States, while living in Romania, I had a completely different profession. I changed careers here when I came 30 years ago. I worked in marketing, in business, and I never actually didn't resonate to me as a human, but that was the system. I grew up in communism, so I had very little choices. And I was an activist there, and I couldn't leave that luggage there. I brought it with me here. And in any possible way, through my work, the people I come across to, I promote activism in any possible way. I liked what Marius said about the boundary. I think it's very different to be, to look at racism from a place of being an American or being an immigrant or being a Romanian American or an Italian American. I think we really need to understand and clarify that boundary and keep it within a healthy setting in order to address such a complex issue as race is.
Yeah. It's interesting you mentioned Italians, and it just occurred to me because I was giving an interview about how the whole conception of being white and black changes in America. And of course, it's interesting that groups such as the Irish, the Italians, the Greeks, and to some extent the Ethiopians but the focus was mostly on the Irish and the Italians and the Greeks. Until the 1940s, they were not considered to be white. So someone who was in the 1920s black, basically, someone from Greece or Sicily, by 1980s became part of the white majority. So the very idea of how race works in terms of so you have your self-identification, and at the same time you have the perception of others. And in America, that's everything, because obviously the nucleus of how everything works, it's around the Anglo-Saxon Protestant nucleus that actually creates the nebula that racism uses to differentiate all of us. So that remains consistently anchored into any point of identification you have. So you see, it's not as simple. Race is a very category, it's a category in flux. You know, it's not fixed in time, and it's not fixed on identity. Cristina mentioned mentioned all this. Kimberly Crenshaw was a person which came up with this term to very clearly express how many identities, simultaneous ways of communicating you have as a social organism, as a social creature. And, it could be sexual, it could be gender, it could be social, it could be color, it could be the way you wear your hair, it could be the music I listen to, it could be my sexual preferences, but against my gender. And so there are a multitude of forms. But at the same time, this is exactly to say that racism works through oppressing, through all these forms, sometimes simultaneously, sometimes in parts. You are oppressed because if you are black, if you're lesbian and black, if you're lesbian, black and disabled. So the layers of discrimination, oppression, and racism you would encounter are phenomenal. There are so many levels that, and here you need pedagogy, you need education, you need dialogue, that is, forms of interaction. You need activism, as you both pointed out. In other words, this is you embark on a journey of both self-discovery, but also discovering yourself through others, that you participate in a movement or a civic moment where literally, you are overcoming some of these problems. So that's one thing. But at the same time, I want to say something related to arts. And that's a point I want to make. And I want to make it, I hope I make it clear so I'm not misunderstood. Racism is not performative. It is experienced. So it's a very, Cristina will understand the distinction. So to some of us, it is performative because I talk about it, but I never experienced it myself. It's very different when someone actually who had been at the other end of history, at the bottom of the heap, and it's been constantly for centuries subjugated, oppressed, and treated differently. For that particular person, racism is not a performative social act. It's a living experience. So these two realms, where the real and the imagination, where the creative and the conceptual, they have to be interlocked into a proper dialogue. So it's good you bring all of that. I think the three of us have come from some different perspectives in terms of discussing this. And finally, it's about living history. I mean, Cristina mentioned being American. I mean, I come from one of the probably, worst hit, not only Eastern Europe, but Northern Transylvania, Jewish and Hungarian and German and Romanian background. And of course, all the Jews in Northern Transylvania and Maramuresh have died in Auschwitz, so for very few survived. So actually, personally speaking, when I talk about racism in Europe and I talk about racism in Romania or in Hungary, it's always a personal thing, you see, because I know entire villages and people who were sent to Auschwitz and other concentration camps because they were considered to be inferior, because they were allegedly of a different race. So that's real, and that personal experience that comes with your activism, I suppose, but also with your honest engagement with the topic. It's extremely important, and all of us have different experiences. There's no better experience than another. This is not a competition between my terrible experience is better than yours. So, I've got 10 uncles in Auschwitz and you have only one. So it doesn't work like that. But it is important at the same time not to completely intellectualize this conversation. We need to go back, like Cristina said, ultimately, you have to go down to the streets. You have to go out in public. Otherwise, it becomes just yet another very sophisticated academic conversation about a topic that actually kills people.
Yeah, I need a deep breath at this moment. And I hear, you know, I think part of what you are saying and what I'm hearing is the fact that racism is internalized. So we all have our own experience, and you know, it's the four pillars of racism, as I know and I experience it, are the fact that it's institutional, it's systemic, internalized, and interpersonal. So it shows up in how we relate to others, and it also shows up in how we receive it from others. So it's a relation, it's an experience more than a lecture or an academic material, which it can be, and it has its role, but it's also a life experience.
Yeah, and you could feel that if you look at immigrant communities, and Romanians, I suppose, are particularly, regrettably in many ways, are particularly subjected to a lot of racism across Europe and even in America. Although in America it's a bit different. They understand racism because for the first time, they realize that actually they are the victims rather than the perpetrators. So they say, hold on a second, you know, why is this black person talking about poverty and racism, and that I'm taking his job because I work so hard, I'm an honest person. And for the first time, so he or she will not have understood that in Romania, but then in America, I realized, hold on a second, actually to these people it matters. Racism is a living creature. In Europe, it's a bit different because they have, for the past 30 years, been mistreated and portrayed in the media in very negative ways. So they internalize a kind of, you know, a second-class mentality, most of them, regrettably, and they're always on the defensive. But then the problem is, of course, that you have some serious problems at home with what I mentioned earlier, with an intra-Romanian racism. So a lot of Romanians from Transylvania and northern Transylvania would actually be very racist towards Romanians from Moldova and Romanians from the south. And of course, you have very serious historical racism against the Roma communities. We'll say a few words about that. It's interesting that in that email, if I can mention it, one of your colleagues who asked, you know, now there will be reparation for slavery in America. Why should I contribute to that as a taxpayer? And then immediately, you know, I mean, that person, of course, very well intended and very generous in terms of his time to talk to us. Never for a second thought, maybe I should pay for the 500 years of slavery in Romania that we kept the Roma in slavery. So the question you should ask yourself ultimately is like, okay, maybe it's not fair that I have to pay in America, but it's totally fair that I have to pay in Romania compensation and acknowledge the victims of racism in Romania. But it never crossed his mind because obviously you will not make this comparison. And that's something that we can contribute to, bring this conversation to the public and address it in a different way. And I repeat that it shouldn't be academic. Cristina is absolutely spot on when she says that ultimately, you know, you can achieve and you have achieved more through other mediums of communication, arts, music, expressivity, that actually should complement, if not completely, you know, supplant academic debate, which has, particularly in countries like Romania, has no leading anywhere. In America it's different, in Britain it's different, but the academic debate in Romania, for example, about racism is completely sterile. It's completely ineffectual. It doesn't lead anywhere, it's not taken seriously, it's not done by people who actually mean it. So the only way there is a serious debate about racism in Romania is from artists, is from public activists, is from NGOs, is from Roma intellectuals and others, is for people who are going into the community, people who go to the housing areas and realize how people live in poverty. I mean, in many ways, the form of activism, it's been imported from the West, and you see this in America. In America, the conversation about race is not academic. That's a completely different field. We know we have a very well-structured field that deals with race relations in Britain, in sociology, in history, in anthropology, in genetics, in biology, in history, of course, but this is completely different. And it's very different what's happening now. So yes, there's the need for a debate about structural, or the 4 pillars of racism. You mentioned, Mihaela, that's hopefully what's happening, because racism is on the rise. Racism returned to political culture in a way that, only 3 months ago would have been completely unthinkable. I mean, you have people saying things that actually, it would have been, when you heard it privately, you were completely ashamed at parties and everything, and now it's completely in the open. So, that implicit and explicit engagement with racism is now our duty as individuals, not just of a particular group. And this is why maybe we can contribute with a bit of a conversation coming from our own perspective and own experiences.
Yeah, to piggyback on what Marius just said in terms of racism being out in the open, this is another, I posted a couple of personal essay type Facebook posts to basically kind of get a sense of what we might talk about today. And in one of them, I said that you should use social media to share information because social media is free. That's actually a really big deal if you think about publications like the New York Times now becoming, inaccessible to most people because of the paywall. Well, hey, with social media, anybody can share what they, articles, opinions, whatever. This is important because it's actually social media that is also contributing to this polarization and this making it acceptable to be racist because all of your friends are racist on social media. So basically like just attracts like is only talking to like. And it's interesting, since the quarantine, this has just compounded on itself in terms of people kind of breaking away on social media and just talking to each other. And so a challenge that I have for all of us, the 3 of us and everybody listening, is to use social media to really be a platform for dialogue. And I've tried my hardest to stay Facebook friends with family friends who I definitely don't agree with, simply for this reason. And I will say that one of my wouldn't say friend to go to the bar with, but artistic spoken word friend from Washington, DC, he and I have polar opposite politics, but he is fearless in his expression of his views, and I respect that. And he engages on social media. He and everyone, including me, are talking on social media. So anyway, I'm just throwing this out there as one more, again, pragmatic way that you can be part of this crucial conversation. And a point that I want to make very explicit, because I am going to return once again to the Romanian-American character of this event. Yes, Romanians have been discriminated against and currently are in places like the UK still. When I was in grad school, Romanians weren't allowed to work in the UK, even though Romania had joined the EU. So that was interesting. So, and this is the fact, and I hear it from so many immigrant friends here in the United States, this sort of tone deaf, whatever is going on here in America in terms of race can't possibly apply to me because my ancestors were not here. I was not here. I have diverse friends, all of these reasons that it could just not apply to you. You are not that racist, KKK, white supremacist American who's been here since 1776. And my reply to that is, you are just blind to the privilege that you have waltzed into. Because we are living in the United States in a white majority country. And simply to be white doesn't matter, where in the world you are actually coming from. Simply being white, you are walking into basically the best seat in society. And so that is the challenge. And this relates to what Marius said in his first segment at the beginning of this talk. This basically majority culture thinking in individual terms and minority culture thinking in collective group terms. So yeah, the majority white culture says, oh, I as an individual, this couldn't possibly apply to me, right? But actually, it is the system, and this loops in what the three of us have been saying, systemic racism. It has nothing to do with you. Of course, you are personally not racist in your heart. I'm willing to believe that. But you, by virtue of being a white American, are part of this system that is racist. And it is all of our responsibility to take action to dismantle that system. And that requires difficult conversations, looking in the mirror and being like, oh my goodness, you know, maybe I am part of a problem. You know, what does that mean? And so I'm not asking us all to apologize for our privilege. I don't want to necessarily get into that kind of conversation, but I am saying that Romanian Americans are walking into a place of privilege, and we cannot ignore and be blind to basically the lucky, I can't think of the expression I want, but the lucky card that we've been given in this country. We have to think about humanity and what Mihaela was saying in terms of our shared humanity and being human, rather than saying, oh wait, it doesn't apply to me.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. One thing that I hear a lot in therapy sessions is, and it's interesting because it's coming from those who participate, from those who want to do something about not being racist. So, you know, it's interesting that even that can be an issue that needs to be addressed and discussed. So the line of, very common, the line of, I'm not a racist, I don't see color.
Yeah.
But and I sit with that, you know, and I'm like, well, but there is color. It's just that it's one color that matters the most. And if you belong to that, you have a privilege. And as Cristina said, it's not, I mean, we cannot apologize for something that was given to us. We haven't done, it's no merit in being white. I haven't done anything to be white.
Yeah, although it hasn't been always the same. I mentioned the Irish. I'll give you my great-grandfather emigrated to America in 1905. So he left Marius Turda in 1905, coming from Eastern Europe, from Hungary. It was part of Hungary at the time. It was roughly okay. It was before the eugenic legislation of the 1920s, where the East Europeans were described as inferior people. But the first letters he sent back to Transylvania were always about, so he went to New York, as most of the East Europeans did at the time, because the big Jewish community in Brooklyn. And they played, of course, they met black people on the streets. And the letters are shocking, because obviously this is for the first time that actually they realize there are people who are actually black. So that's, you know, in the 1910s, as I come from Eastern Europe, you didn't walk into the white privilege. In the 1970s or 60s or 1980s, or some of the most, the majority of American Romanians emigrated, or their parents, in the 50s, 60s, 70s. They already belonged to a different category, let alone it was a Cold War. So they came from a place that already was, you know, they were welcome in this way. So again, let's not forget that, because, you know, the whole history of the diaspora, including the Romanian one, which is not the most numerous comparing to the Hungarian, the Lithuanian, or the Poles, but of course many Jews from what is today Romania actually were born. They would have been part of this, and they had a horrible time. It was extremely difficult for them to. This is why they created the churches, they created the networks, the associations. They can play popular music, they could wear the costumes. I mean, Cristina celebrates Romanian Blouse Day, but I mean, in the 1910s, you could go to Cleveland and you could participate the Romanian National Day. And they had it rough. and they were taking jobs that the black people didn't want to do, and they always write about this. I mean, we are below the blacks in this country, so it's interesting to hear someone in the 1980s or 1990s. Cristina is absolutely right. You do walk into this now, and whether you like it or not, whether you do it on purpose, whether you are the person, you come with the color of your skin. Now, regrettably, after centuries of debate about this, after scientists demonstrating very clearly that there is no difference between us. I mean, as a matter of fact, it's a bigger difference between me and Cristina than between me and the black person, genetically speaking. So, however, you are carrying your skin on the sleeve, and everybody asserts a particular identity about you because you have a different color. And you rightly pointed out, you arrive in America as a Romanian, you are white. And that you have to realize that has got the benefits, and those benefits are not questioned because they belong to a culture that was built on exploitation of other people and subjugation of other people. So we're talking about slavery and recurrent and consistent abusive relationship. This is like an abusive relationship where it's not only the victim needs to speak out, but also the perpetrator needs to speak up.
I cannot say more than I completely agree. And you're touching on a very important point from a psychological perspective, which is in an abusive relationship, trauma is experienced on both sides. So there is trauma for the oppressor, and one of the major one when it comes to racism is the fear, the traumatic fear of losing the privilege to be white.
Yeah, and there is a term for that which is called white fragility. So
exactly,
that's the term that you've got the book there. So I mean, of course, I take issues to. But in many ways, that's exactly, in many ways, she's correct in saying that actually a white person will do everything but to be called a racist. So the moment you call a white person a racist, everybody starts twitching, we're hiding in the corner, I have to leave unexpectedly, or my wife is calling me, I disappear from the room. It's a panic mode, which shows how fragile we are in a way. As a majority, we never built a healthy relationship with ourselves. So that's a term that people tend to use now, although now we actually understand that to be a bit more complex than that, because obviously we know there is no white, as much as there is no perfect black, there is no perfect white. So any white person is different, whether we like it or not, but that's exactly what I suppose our conversation here as three white people, exactly that, enunciated and illustrated quite clearly, that the three of us are extremely different as white people, very different. And I'm not talking about gender differences here. I'm just really talking about we are interrelated and we understand each other very well and we disagree on issues, but we are very different. And that's exactly the point we should be making in this conversation. I apologize, I interrupted you, Mihaela, but
that's okay with me. I'm trying to see if we have any questions here coming from the audience. I see a comment here that sounds worth addressing. What practical suggestions do you have in terms of activism to actually promote change? Conversations such as this are great, but we are still a bunch of white privileged folks discussing racism.
Okay, well, I'll take that one.
You go first.
I grew up in a Fox News home. There are so many things, and what I would encourage you is to not think, kind of not be scrambling, oh my, there's nothing that I could possibly do. I mean, I actually have a list right here. This is my little office corner in our teeny tiny Denver downtown apartment, a list of things that I can do because I wanted to like always have them in my face to remind me. And so in this list, decolonize, first of all. in any conversation you have, consider the oppressed's point of view. This is a very simple theater activity, actually, putting yourself in the character's shoes, putting yourself in somebody else's shoes, thinking how it must be for them. This is using your imagination. And once you start really expanding your mind in this way, you'll find that things don't seem as foreign as they might have in the first place. So I already mentioned decolonize the classroom. You need to teach all kinds of sources, absolutely. But even just in conversations in daily life, trying to get all kinds of different points of view, talk to people, conversation. Yes, we're having a conversation on Facebook right now. I really hope that this is a good blueprint for everybody to go forward with your friends, with your family, with your community, to talk about difficult things. So I mentioned that I grew up in a Fox News house. Well, I'm kind of the polar opposite of that, not to get too political, not to get red and blue, like Marius said, left and right, but it's important because even though that was the case, we still came together at the dinner table every night and talked through issues. And that's how it is today. My parents and I are constantly talking about everything. And you don't have to agree with the person you're talking to learn from them, you know? So that's what I'm getting at there. Another one is write creatively, or write anything. You know, for me, I like to write poems and plays. Well, I'm gonna go write some poems and plays. But if you're more of a policy mind, you could write to your congressman. You know, you could try to actually get involved in local government, if that's the sort of thing that appeals to you. So politics is definitely an option, although of course that's got its own, but we have to be engaged in the democratic system if we want change ultimately. So we do have to be involved in politics a little bit, even if that just means voting. Vote, that's important, November, vote. And so I have one more here, and that is something that Marius said a little earlier in terms of the arts. So you don't just have to be an artist to experience other cultures. You can simply be a consumer. You can simply be on your couch watching a documentary about a part of the world that you don't know anything about. There are a lot of BLM documentaries right now on Netflix, and they're amazing. I've watched a couple with my partner. You can just educate yourself and relax on your couch. Or you can start listening to music from an ethnic group that you don't know much about. Or you can watch a foreign language film from a part of the world that you don't know much about. So those are just the 4 examples that are on my wall right here, but hopefully that can get you thinking of, you know, it doesn't have to be this one thing that you don't just have to march, okay? You can do all kinds of things.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And if you have a Romanian background, in whatever form, you cannot by all means be excused for not looking into your country's racial past. I mean, ultimately, there is something very important. I mean, both Cristina and I have been involved in projects in Romania. So in addition to me teaching in Oxford, of course, I teach about race and racism, and actually everything that Cristina just described apply to the British context, which is slightly different, of course. But I have also something which is very dear to me in terms of personal history. I already mentioned a few things, but also in terms of educating younger Romanians about race and racism, and how it's very disheartening to see how little they know about things that happened in the past in Romania. They don't learn this in schools. I mean, in America or in Britain, we have the privilege. You know, I want to read a Black scholar. I go to the library and open the books. I've got everything at my disposal to self-educate myself, to decolonize my thinking, to be progressive, to be able to have a conversation about these topics. But in Romania, they don't have that. So then even more so, people like us who are abroad, we can help by discussing, by breaking down barriers there. So I, for example, organize these exhibitions, and I tour Romania with exhibitions about eugenics and racism in the interwar period and about the Holocaust. And I went to schools. And they didn't. I mean, so there's one category of people that didn't know anything about it, so they're absolutely shocked that actually Romanians could kill Jews. The other things were actually they knew about it, but from the racist perspective, they were very proud of that, and they regretted for not having killed more Roma. So what you encounter if you don't have the proper education is that actually you grow up thinking racism is absolutely perfectly attuned to your national development. So it's synonymous. A good Romanian is a good hater of Roma. It's a good racist, because there was never a public debate about that there in a way to actually tell someone who's 15, this is unacceptable. This is what happened, and you need to know that, whether you like it or not. I mean, we've been to schools. Cristina grew up and born in America, grew up there. No one liked it when you are 7 or 10 to be lectured on anything, let alone things about civic education or about the importance of liberty and all these ideals which we hold dear. So they wouldn't like it that much when you're 17, 18 to talk about these issues, but actually it is necessary for the anti-racist education of the general public. This is not political, because there is systemic discrimination against the Roma, against immigrants, not only in Romania, but against trans people. I mean, the level of sexism in Romania and the level of xenophobia and homophobia in Romania, it's appalling. I mean, it's everywhere in Eastern Europe, but I mean, if you are in any way a bit different, not only through the color of your skin, but through your sexual orientation, you are in serious danger, and so on and so forth. So yes, do that, but also think of the place you come from, if you can help in these respects. And there is a lot of things that you've learned in America, and most of us learn in abroad, that actually can be put to very good use back in Romania in terms of how to deal with that. I commend Cristina always for her work, because she really goes there and she does that. I've tried to do this as well, but I mean, it's difficult for me, but that's the way I see. We need to tackle this openly, not superficially. There's a very superficial conversation about racism in Romania. There's a very superficial, under the political correctness, debate about the Roma, and so on and so forth. And that has to change. It's unacceptable after what's happening in America, what's happening in the world, to still behave as this is not your problem, like Cristina put it. What's my connection with these people? Well, that's a question. Hemingway asked this at the end of For Whom the Bell Tolls. You never ask this question. They told for you.
If I may just jump in, because I think Marius hit on a really, really crucial point for all of the viewers who have kids. Education. And so education happens in the classroom. It happens in community programs like that Marius initiates in Romania. And education also happens when you're just hanging out with your friends growing up. And that's something that I really commend my parents for being very active to make sure that we had an integrated upbringing. They actually were delighted to move to North Carolina from Colorado. That's where I was born, actually, because they wanted to raise their family in an integrated city. So it is up to you. If you notice that, all of the little kids are hanging out with people who just look like them, well, maybe you can find some, summer camps or, parks, or, kind of try to meet some new people to find, and this, I'm seeing this particularly with the Romanian diaspora now as I'm approaching 40, Romanians kind of sticking together in the United States. And that's not how it was when I was growing up. I didn't know a single Romanian when I was growing up, except my dad. And that's how my parents wanted it. They wanted us to just be with all kinds of different people. So yeah, anyway, that's to the parents in the audience.
Yeah, and I would say support businesses as well. I mean, that can be another form of activism. Engaging conversations. I think it requires a lot from us to stand up for our opinion, which sometimes it's really hard, especially with friends or family. We tend not to disagree. We tend to held back and not discuss subjects that are too touchy, but it's worth doing that, because that's how we actually have a dialogue. That's the only way to have a dialogue. And that's a form of activism. I know that sometimes we don't look at all of this as activisms. We want something bigger. We want something that makes a huge difference. But the small things are building up. So I would say look into any possibility on a daily life. Let's see if we have anything here. I think there are lots of comments, which I'm thrilled to see. There is something that I'm not sure what's this in regard of, but I would say it anyway. It says, I disagree that we are not a minority. The fact that our skin color is white in America doesn't automatically make us part of the majority. We are immigrants with white skin and accents.
Yeah, I suppose that's correct. I don't know that particular situation, but I think America is more flexible when it comes to the English language and the accents, because, I mean, whenever I go to America, no one will know I'm from Romania unless I tell them. That's absolutely impossible. But I suppose the person is absolutely correct in terms of saying that you have the identity of the immigrant as well as the identity of whatever group you come from. And that's not necessarily only ethnic, could be religious. You know, some people identify themselves in a religious way more profoundly or more directly than others, you know, be that Catholic or Muslim or whatever. But the statue of the immigrant is something that regrettably America is very keen to highlight. So you in, but not completely in. Like Trump said to those 4 congresswomen, some of us are more American than others. So by saying that, some of you should go back to the backward countries you come from, although 3 of them were born in America. What he said basically, and this goes back to the founding fathers of the American democracy, some of us are whiter than the other whites. Some of us are the Anglo-Saxon Protestant nucleus which created this country. The rest there are degrees of whiteness. It percolates all the way down to the ramifications at the margins of the American society. So I don't disagree with the person. I think we just spoke a bit across purpose in terms of what he said or she said and what we are saying. And that's something that you'll never overcome. Maybe 2nd or 3rd generation, I suppose that's the way it works. But you'll always be reminded of that. But you'll always be reminded of that anywhere you go. You could move from, from Moldova to Cluj in Transylvania. You will be reminded for the rest of your life you're from Moldova. You'll always be an immigrant. So if you think of a microcosmos and a macrocosmos, if you're an immigrant, you're an immigrant anywhere you go, be that a small village, you always be outsider, or be that a big country like America. The question you should ask yourself is that, how can I creatively use that condition of the immigrant to do something with my life? All of us are immigrants from this planet, from this world, but we use it creatively to actually do something, to move forward, to better ourselves, to better our families, to better those around us. And this is what we're saying here, the 3 of us, that is not to dismiss and to trivialize real experience of people who are like, okay, well, all of you are white, you privilege, what we're talking about here. Mm-hmm. The question is that itself is part of the whole debate we're having, and that should be embraced rather than, it's like with any other identity that you repress very much. You hide it in the closet. You pretend you're not an immigrant. You pretend you could, say, I don't know, tomato or tomato, you say in America, I don't know, whatever word. And you do this excessively until you exhaust yourself existentially. Only 50 years later to be uncovered in a corner of your room that actually you're still that same immigrant that arrived in America 40 years ago. You're still that, incomplete person, and your life has been a failure. So no, embrace your immigration status, embrace your immigrant condition, and do something with it, that you're proud of it, and everyone else is proud of it. And it doesn't really matter the color of your skin.
I couldn't agree more. Sorry, Mihaela, did you want to jump in? And then
No, go ahead.
Okay.
Checking comments here. Go
yeah,
ahead.
so in terms of what I tell my students, and this is perhaps not the most politically correct thing, but it's the historically correct thing, and that is that migration is the story of human history. So we are always leaving one place to find our home somewhere else, even if that's, you know, across the street. But like, right? So migration, we are all immigrants, like Marius said, from somewhere to somewhere. This is perhaps not directly related to today's discussion, but it is related to being Romanian American. And that is, it is so cool that we have another country in addition to the United States. That should be celebrated, you know, that's awesome. But then if we take the flip side of that, if we consider the African American story here, you have European national groups coming to the United States who can be proud of the country they're originally from. But how does that then make the African American population feel, whose ancestors were brought here against their will, right? Obviously before nationhood, not knowing exactly where their roots are, or even where to track their descendants or how. So that is actually a privilege to have Romania and be like, awesome, I got Romania, that's so cool. African Americans, if they are descendants of slaves, do not have that privilege.
And if some of you have Transylvania, the true Transylvania, even better. I don't think it's even cooler to like call yourself from Transylvania in America. So yeah, celebrate that as much as you can. That's your historical legacy.
Yeah. Well, we have lots of comments here. I don't know what else to choose. And I hope after we finish this that the two of us, Cristina, could go back and read all the comments and questions and then pass them along to you, Marius, and hopefully we can respond if there is more, even from those who may choose to watch this recorded after we are going to finish today. So any closing wisdom words for those who are listening to us today?
You want to go first, Cristina?
I think I should, because I should deliver the stage to you to actually end our event. So it is very simple. One of the quotes that I always tell my students is Desmond Tutu, who was a Nobel Peace Prize winner, a minister in South Africa. He said, make your little bit of good where you are. It's those little bits of good all put together that change the world. So that's my pragmatic activist call to action.
Thank you.
It's hard to follow up on Desmond Tutu, Cristina. Thank you very much for dropping that on my lap. I'm going to cite from Mandela now, just to. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to probably cite from Mihaela Campion or something like that, Alexandri, something like that. No. Just firstly, I should like to say thank you so much for this. I greatly enjoyed it, and yeah, I'm happy to return to this conversation if there is interest and you feel that we have something useful to say. Now, in terms of a final word, you know, I'm a very simple person from Northern Transylvania who got into this thing not necessarily by own volition. You know, it just happened that life carried me away on its waves, and I was like a floating, you know, fish. You know, whatever I could stop for a moment of respite, I would stop and think and see what's next. But one thing I learned is that, you know, maybe racism doesn't affect you personally. And it's the case with most of us. I mean, you know, apart from history and my you know, family back in the day, you know, in the interwar period, but I personally never been subjected to any form of racism. But that's not the point. I mean, the point is not that you are not subject to the racism. The whole point is how you react to it. So how we react to racism is what defines us. not the fact that we are completely indifferent and stay aside merely because we haven't been subjected to racist abuse. So what defines us, and I will leave our friends and people who are listening to us with this, is how we are moving on from this moment. How do we react to what's happening around us? We discussed here a few possibilities and we threw a few ideas around, but ultimately it is a personal choice, and that you have to live by it. In other words, you have to own it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I cannot agree more with that. It's our choice, and nothing is too little when it comes to activism. I think it's important to believe that in any form that we can contribute, it's going to matter. And I really appreciate you being here today. I feel so humbled and touched, and thank you for accepting our invitation, and I hope we can have another one in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Good night.
Thank you, everybody, for listening to us, and please join our cause.